Welcome to Connection Academy Podcast, a series of conversations on what success might look like in a truly connected world. One where we have a better understanding of ourselves, each other, and the endless possibilities of life around us. I'm your host, Kristen Ransom. Today's conversation is about the ever-relevant topic of stress and anxiety, which is the world's most commonly diagnosed psychological disorder. Stress is a part of our everyday lives, and since there is simply no avoiding it, the task for mental health professionals has become to further our understanding of how we might better understand and manage how stress shows up in our lives.
Stressing the body is not always a bad thing. It makes us function, it makes us move forward, it makes us more vigilant. Stress is definitely normal and part of life, and it's very much, something that you can handle. In contrast to anxiety is really about a real or perceived threat. There's this constant sense of worry, and of course that's really unpleasant to feel, but it's also really debilitating, where you feel like your chest is tightening, you feel these waves of emotions that are just kind of consuming you. It's really difficult to kind of do anything. Knowing that there are different options for treatment is really important. But I think having that openness to explore what it would mean to be healed, an important aspect for psychology and especially seeing a therapist is to really bring you to that point of experiencing the emotion, which is incredibly difficult. But, it's really difficult to try and bring about any sense of awareness or change in your client if they're so stuck in this defensive response of, well, my thoughts dictate how I live. It ends up becoming a really vicious cycle where your whole livelihood becomes dominated by your thoughts.
Today I speak with Gordon Shaw, who is a counselling psychologist and mental health specialist. This conversation is part of a wider series discussing topics related to mental health. If you are someone who would like to better understand what stress and anxiety is and how it might be showing up in your life, lean in and enjoy.
I've always had this passion to understand why and how people behave the way they do. And I think a large part of that is also linked to kind of understanding my own mental processes. But even the anxiety of even a podcast like this, the feelings or some thoughts that I possibly had around this was, what happens if I stutter or say something wrong? How would Kristen kind of take that? And of course, it's definitely rational, I would like to say, but the consequence of me perhaps stuttering isn't as severe as I would make it in my mind. So I've always had that fascination of trying to understand, how people kind of work and operate. But of course, this is very different depending on the person's background and how they've been raised and, a number of different factors. But also added to that, a large body of my family is in the health kind of sciences realm, so doctors and social workers. So I think there's always been that drive, at least a core kind of value in my family of helping others and kind of getting that kind of benefit or seeing the benefit, which is quite rewarding at the end of the day. But definitely to try and impose some sense of change, which is I think the driving force of my work currently, and I think specifically to try and access people who don't have the capacity to afford services such as psychology or even psychiatry. In South Africa, I'm registered as a counselling psychologist. However, in saying that, a large body of my work is clinical work, so working with top 1% of kind of psychological and psychiatric disorders. Of course, anxiety, which we can get to, is actually the highest diagnosed psychological disorder in the world. Added to that, there's, things like trauma, which is a special interest of mine, which often it goes hand in hand with the kind of social context that many countries, especially developing countries, face. So South Africa, for instance, as you know, is a developing country, but their gross inequalities in terms of access to resources, poverty, that sort of thing. And of course, with that, we often see violence and disparaging approaches to handle grievances and even just engaging in a conversation. So, a large body of my work is really in the clinical realm, but at the same time, not everyone has, say, a psychiatric disorder or a quite severe personality disorder, So I definitely do also deal with, the more common life kind of challenges. So things related to marriage, relationships, divorce, even children. And I suppose the scope of psychological practice is so vast that it's always exciting and it's always interesting to kind of see different people and to try and help them in a way that is also kind of stimulating for you.
Something you said there was that there's such a vast array of psychological processes, experiences, way of experiencing life around us. And it's definitely something that comes up in these conversations. An interview I had a few weeks ago, something that came up was that mental health is being spoken about so much more, but without, as you said, having voices that have studied the topic extensively, lending themselves to the conversation, mental health is at risk of becoming everything and nothing all at once. And with such a vast topic, it is important to state that it is vast and we all experience these things differently, but then to drill down onto specific topics so that we can start to better understand them. So I'm quite excited to get into that with you today. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned that stress and anxiety alongside depression is one of the most commonly diagnosed psychological disorders. Maybe if you could speak into that a bit further. I think maybe where we could start would just be defining what do we mean when we speak about stress and anxiety.
Before I kind of answer that question, just to go back to what you were mentioning there, Kristen, was, there's a lot of voices at the moment, and I think that's good. It helps the conversation, but even being a psychologist doesn't mean that I know everything, but of course there's certain elements that people need to be aware of, and hopefully we will address some of those core kind of areas today when it comes to anxiety. But in answering your question, I think it's people often conflate stress with anxiety. So, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed, I'm so anxious. I don't think people, fully understand what this means. When we think of stress, we need to think of it both as beneficial and harmful. Our bodies are designed to have an appropriate level of stress. It makes us function, it makes us move forward, it makes us more vigilant. And of course, stressing the body is not always a bad thing. So, a common example here would be preparing for an exam, which I think many people would be able to relate to, because there's the inherent stress of knowing when you are going to write, how much information you need to study, how many chapters you need to read. But then on top of that, you may become further stressed, and I'll get into what stress really means, for our bodies, but you may get further stressed with knowing that you still have to walk your dog at 4 o'clock every day. You have to help your family with particular chores, or whatever it may be. There's always going to be things that are happening around you. The area where stress differs from anxiety is that stress is definitely normal and part of life, and it's very much something that you can handle. And what I mean by this, in contrast to anxiety is really about a real or perceived threat. So something that in our environment we perceive, we think may be dangerous to us or harmful to our livelihoods or to our sense of self, in terms of our self-esteem, and I'll speak a little bit more to that just now, or it can be very real. So, a perfect example of a real threat here would be seeing a lion in front of you. And with that, you may start sweating. You may think in your mind, if I run away, Will the lion chase me? And of course, this isn't a everyday example or everyday occurrence, but if we were to translate this into a real kind of scenario, just think about getting in your car every day. I like to say that it's always like entering the lottery. You never know when someone's going to hit you, and that could be something that you're anxious about. You could be really anxious about possibly not getting to work on time. And this can then translate into having thoughts of, well, if I was late last week, I'm late this week, what is my boss going to say? And now this sounds very much like stress, but there is a definite perceived threat here, which is your job. Your job is on the line. And of course, this may cause you to drive a little bit faster or to try and come up with a really good excuse for not making it on time. And so stress and anxiety do go hand in hand. But we must remember that anxiety is a more pronounced and prolonged emotion that we ourselves feel, whereas stress can be anything that really comes in our environment and can evoke a particular response from us. One way to kind of think about stress is really in terms of, on a kind of biological level, is cortisol. And of course, when we are stressed, we feel a little bit jittery or worried or even edgy. We may struggle to concentrate. These are also characteristic signs of anxiety. But one way to kind of tell that you are stressed is when your cortisol levels increase, and this also often allows us to retain more water in our body, or even causes us to become excessively hungry or perhaps not hungry at all. I know, to use myself as an example, I don't like to eat when I'm stressed at all. I just like to get things done, and then afterwards I'm ravenous. So, of course, we all behave in different ways with regards to stress, but anxiety is something that, once again, is something that we will respond to differently. And of course, there are different aspects of anxiety, if we look at it on a kind of spectrum, but we can also speak a little bit more to that just now. But I think just to add to this conversation, before I get your thoughts, Kristen, is really around a new kind of term which has come up in literature called anticipatory anxiety, especially around COVID-19. And I think it's important to speak about this because many of us are excessively worried, and I think it's normal to feel worried about our loved ones contracting the virus, or even passing away from the virus. And many people have been hit financially with regards to losing their jobs and worried about how they're going to ensure some sense of continuity of care for their families. And of course, it creates this ripple effect of preparing for the worst case scenario, which is perfectly normal and rational because you want to have a kind of contingency plan in place, but it can also be quite devastating once you're in that cycle. So I think it's really important to normalize anxiety as normal. Earlier we mentioned that it is actually the highest diagnosed disorder, specifically generalized anxiety disorder in the world. And a statistic that I got here through a little bit of research was 284 million people worldwide in 2017 would experience some form of anxiety and obviously sought out some sense of help. And so, if you think you're immune to this, perhaps you're not being as open as you'd like about it, or perhaps you've already sought help. So this topic is certainly something that many people should be able to relate with, or at least have experienced some of the kind of signs and symptoms that we will speak further to today.
Something I just wanted to comment on there. So you mentioned that stress can serve us in a really positive way, but also in a negative way. I find this quite inspiring, and maybe if we could just go into that a bit further. From what I understand from what you've said is stress protects us because it helps us pick up threats in our immediate environment, which enable us to respond in a way that would protect us, which seems like quite a primitive emotional and cognitive response that we've developed over time. But then when this might become unhealthy is then when we are picking up perceived threats, which are not, in fact, real threats. And our minds can kind of go down this downward spiral with them and blow them up out of proportion. And that's where anxiety creeps in, if I've understood you correctly.
When we think about stress and anxiety, it's something, and most things in life need to be experienced in moderation. So if you have a healthy level of stress, and this is, something that you are aware of and able to deal with in a way that doesn't disrupt your life in any significant manner. So yes, of course, using the studying for an exam scenario, you may need to study for 8 hours in the day, but you're still able to go and have a shower, to have something to eat, handle perhaps getting an unexpected telephone call. But someone with anxiety or an excessive amount of anxiety around, say, their performance around the exam may not study at all because they just feel like if they did start studying, they're going to fail anyway. This is something that I often see in a therapy scenario where people are really struggling just to get started with a particular task because of these overwhelming thoughts that they are having. But I think as you said, on a very basic and primitive level, our normal stress response moving into our sympathetic nervous system where our blood starts to rush through our heart a little bit faster, and of course we become a little bit more alert is certainly to make us aware of any potential threat. And this does serve to protect us on a very basic human level. But it can be bad when we are constantly having our heart elevated in a way that it's beating beyond what it should. Things like high blood pressure and heart disease are significantly linked to the type of stress that people do experience. And there's a large amount of research that suggests that, people who kind of self-identify as stressed or anxious tend to live a significant proportion less than people who are, happy and kind of stress-free. But in saying that, the way that our world has been created is certainly not stress-free, especially in a kind of westernized context where you're expected to kind of leave the house when you're 18, pursue studies or start working. And then, of course, with that are some real grown-up kind of decisions which come with, paying for rent or buying a property or starting a family. And as much as we would want to kind of wish anxiety away, if you're a wizard at Hogwarts, you can't always do that.
If only, that would be amazing. Yeah, I think, I'll share a bit here. I actually struggled with anxiety towards the end of high school. And over the last few years, my relationship with stress has changed quite a bit. And I'm curious to hear some of the stories you have worked on with people in this regard. But what happened with me is that whenever I do feel stressed now, I make intentional effort to set aside some time and to acknowledge what are those perceived threats that I'm picking up, and I make a list of them, and I look at each one of them, and I kind of look at how realistic is this, and is it actually likely to happen? And if it did happen, what would be the worst case scenario? And I find that's something that really helps me, because then that fear, instead of it lurking in the back of my mind, holding me back, making me feel hopeless and paralyzed in that emotion, I can look at it more rationally and focus on what I can control in that given situation. And it enables me to make a better response. So, and that's changed my relationship with stress, because now I can be grateful for stress because I can see how it benefits me and urges my behavior in a positive way. But I wonder then, how do we pick up that tipping point in terms of where stress is benefiting us and where it's then becoming, really acutely aware of those perceived threats that aren't in fact as dangerous as our minds are telling us they are. I'm not sure if you could comment on this and how we could perhaps become better at managing the difference between those.
your question is really important, because just to try and understand that tipping point is so difficult, but also so easy to kind of identify. When you kind of caught in the cycle of just trying to catch your breath, I often use this analogy where you feel like your chest is tightening, you feel these waves of emotions that are just kind of consuming you. It's really difficult to kind of do anything. And that sense of paralysis can certainly, or that downward spiral can certainly kick in. And, in saying that, people tend to avoid emotions and avoid feeling what they're feeling by just saying, oh, well, it will pass. And it often doesn't. So I think, a technique which you've described for your own process is really a technique that we use in cognitive behavioral therapy specifically, where you literally, jot down what your thoughts are, how you're experiencing these particular emotions, what are these emotions, and as you said, the rationality of these emotions. But I think an important addition to that kind of record or log is to say, well, what is the alternative way of feeling? But people are so caught up in, oh my gosh, what happens if I don't do well in my test or exam? And that does become a paralysis or area of paralysis. And so, I often just tell people just to pause in the moment. It sounds so easy and so simple, but just to pause in the moment, to assess the temperature. And of course, this is kind of a metaphor for, what they're experiencing in the moment. So is it cold or hot? How intense is it? Is it humid for you? To use some really practical areas just to, ways of kind of allowing someone to describe what they're feeling. And then just to kind of slowly bring them back, whether it's through grounding techniques or paced breathing, just to bring them back to the here and now. It's very difficult to kind of tell someone how you're feeling if you can't even maintain eye contact with them. So it's really important to kind of just bring yourself back to a centered space, which is often so difficult. But when talking about the spectrum of anxiety, of course, anxiety can be healthy and normal. And I often say to people that it shows that you care. If your loved one is traveling overseas and you didn't have a thought about their well-being, perhaps you don't care about them, but if they are traveling overseas and you thought, well, they must have landed by now, maybe I should send them a message, that for me would be a normal response. Perhaps an unhealthy and unbeneficial response is to send 18 messages the moment the person has landed, because perhaps they haven't even turned on their cell phone yet. And that's the kind of excessive worry where it would move from just a kind of anxious response to an anxious disorder. And of course, we get different types. The most common is a generalized anxiety disorder, where there's this excessive worry of general things in the person's environment that can make them anxious, and it doesn't have to be specific. A large part of how we respond to our environment is definitely conditioned through our experiences. So if you have witnessed a dog bite someone before, you may be more adverse, towards coming close to a dog in the future. That could be something that can cause anxiety. But then again, you're also worried about preparing for a test or an exam. That can also cause anxiety. And it ends up becoming a really vicious cycle where your whole livelihood becomes dominated by your thoughts. And of course, there are different specifiers when we look at symptoms, but a common one which can be diagnosable, and often what a more severe kind of presentation of an anxious disorder would be agoraphobia. So being afraid to even leave your house because there's no sense of control within your environment, because everything is perceived as a threat. Everyone is, not necessarily out to get you, but you may not be able to please or kind of do a good enough job. But, in saying that, there is, of course, a very social element to anxiety. And that's where kind of social anxiety disorder then creeps in, and this is really around feelings of rejection or dismissal, worried about how people may perceive you. And I think in the age of social media, this is a highly diagnosable kind of disorder that we do see, because, if I think if you had to ask a teenager today to not be on Instagram for a week, they may freak out. And in addition to that, there's a kind of warped perception of reality, I would say, because there's so many filters and all these wonderful treatments and things that alter a human body in a way that causes a lot of anxiety for people who are trying to aspire to this particular goal, whether it's a social media influencer that they, looking towards, or even a celebrity. It's kind of grossly disproportional. That then moves into the realm of even eating disorders that we see to try and look a particular way. But of course, we know that a large part of social anxiety is linked to self-esteem. I won't speak to the eating disorders, but self-esteem plays a huge role in how we perceive ourselves and how we interact with others based on that perception. And so when we think of anxiety in terms of disorders, we have to think of generalized anxiety, which can be anyone or anything. Social anxiety, which is obviously specific to particular people or social interactions or spaces that involve people. And then, of course, we kind of go to the more niche end of the spectrum, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which falls more under the realm of trauma and stress-related disorders. But previously it was kind of in this realm because the same symptoms which many anxious disorders, people who have anxious presentations share in terms of hypervigilance, kind of sweating, difficulty concentrating, increased heart rate. So it's almost like a trauma response because you on a basic level, biologically feel under threat and under siege. And I've highlighted here in my notes, worry. There's this constant sense of worry, and of course that's really unpleasant to feel, but it's also really debilitating. And one thing that I haven't mentioned also along the spectrum is specific unrational kind of threats, which would be phobic responses to certain things. Anxiety is very much rational. Whether it is a real thing that you can see, or it's even a perceived threat, it can be bizarre, but it's something that you're experiencing. Whereas, a phobia is something that is very much irrational, but also has an element of rationality to it. You can be afraid of an animal to the point where you would try to avoid the animal, but not every animal is going to bite you, for instance. Not every dog is going to bite you. So it's always tricky to talk about the spectrum itself of different kind of anxiety presentations, because it's always going to be different for different people. The difference between, say, experiencing a form of anxiety and experiencing an anxiety disorder would really be the intensity and the duration in which you've experienced it. So, if you're constantly anxious for a period of 6 months, whether it's general or specific, will fall into the realm of a disorder. As professionals, we would determine the level of impact that it would have in your life. So, are you still able to perform day-to-day tasks and activities, or is it incredibly crippling in the way that, and as we've already spoken about, anxiety and depression often go hand in hand, where, you're so anxious that it's better just to stay in bed for the whole day, not to get up. You're so worried about your performance, whether it's with your kids or at work, and it really just impacts everything. One thing that your spouse may say to you may trigger an anxious response of, oh my gosh, he or she may leave me, I've really messed up here, and yet all of that is completely kind of amplified in a way that wasn't intended for.
Yeah, I love that you've touched on the fact that anxiety does lie on a spectrum, and that it does range from being quite general and light to some more severe disorders that might evolve from that. I think that there's definitely a lot that we can unpack, and there's so much education that is needed on the spectrum and the various disorders that lie within the spectrum. I kind of want to draw back a little while ago. You said that when we feel anxious, it can feel like our livelihoods are dominated by our thoughts. What I was thinking when I heard you say this was, I spend a lot of time researching well-being, and something that comes up over and over again are those 4 pillars of well-being, or human intelligence, or energy. They often get termed differently. So it would be your physical intelligence, intellectual intelligence, emotional and spiritual intelligence. And it seems like anxiety, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, anxiety largely resides within that intellectual cognitive space of thought, process, thinking about the information that's coming at us in our day to day. And when our minds are dominated by this thought and worry, it then can affect our physical and shows up in our bodies and our physical response. Something then you also commented on is that one of the bottlenecks of us actually addressing this, which I definitely agree with, we often hold back from getting in touch with our emotions. So I wonder if you could comment on this. What role does getting in touch with our emotions play in us taking action on our anxiety or just general stress in our lives? I also ask this off the back of many other conversations that have been around emotional trauma, creating space for connection, and so on, where the conversation around empathy and feeling comes up over and over again.
Just to kind of address the first part of what you said there, Kristen, is, psychology is by and large a westernized concept that, whether, you kind of look at the founding fathers up until now, have, as you said, largely embodied a kind of cognitive approach to handling, many of the emotions and things that we experience on a physical level. And right back to Rene Descartes, who posed a mind-body distinction, these debates have been going on for decades and decades. Is the mind and is the soul linked to the body, and what role do they all play? As a practitioner and as someone who has a keen interest in trying to bring about well-being in my clients, psychology can sometimes be incredibly limited. The term that we use for constantly thinking, constantly having these overwhelming thoughts is called rumination. And many people, you will find, will ruminate to a point where they cannot really engage with the underlying feeling. And of course, that's where psychology can sometimes be limited. It's really difficult to try and bring about any sense of awareness or change in your client if they're so stuck in this defensive response of, well, my thoughts dictate how I live. And of course, it does also serve as an avoidance to really address how that person may be feeling. So I think, having a keen kind of understanding. And on a side note, Netflix has done a really wonderful job in terms of showing different forms of medicine, different forms of treatment for common disorders and common kind of experiences. I think the show may be called Unwell. And one particular segment was to talk about bee therapy, for instance. And it sounds really bizarre, and I'm obviously not necessarily advocating for something like that, but I think knowing that there are different options for treatment is really important. So, exploring that spiritual side of a person is really important. Now, I may not take the same faith or the same kind of culture as you, but I think having that openness to explore what it would mean to be healed in that particular context is really important. Many African cultures perform a particular form of kind of trance, which in many ways looks, and at least from a professional point of view, looks like a schizophrenic episode. And yet it can bring about great relief and great healing. Another common kind of or contentious debate currently is the use of psycholytics when it comes to post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think as we hopefully move towards understanding the role of these drugs in brain functioning, but also regulation of such, hopefully we will get to a point where it can be effective and safe to that point. But I think an important aspect for psychology and especially seeing a therapist is to really bring you to that point of experiencing the emotion, which is incredibly difficult. And you may not be able to do that, in 1 or 2 sessions. We have a culture of, at least in South Africa, where quick fixes are desired. And, something that you've been holding for 3 or 4 years, or perhaps from your childhood, is incredibly difficult to kind of release and bring about a sense of resolution in an hour session. So before you even get to that point of bringing the person to the emotion, you have to understand, as you said, what is that tipping point for the person? And I think this is really the realm where search engines such as Google have a really important role and aspect to play, because the first thing that a person will do is not go to a therapist if they've never been to one before. They may type in on Google, what are some of the signs and symptoms of anxiety, or why do I always feel worried? They're common search terms which, encourage people to have a look at, because it's so interesting. If we are able to transform the emotional data that we have on search engines like Google, we can also then provide individualized responses to individuals that are seeking help and assistance. And something that I'm thinking of as kind of speaking about this is suicide as another form of, I may be feeling certain things, I may wish to end my life, but what do I actually do? And this is really the realm where I think information and especially kind of social media has a huge role to kind of play in addressing that. Inherently, to kind of answer your question more formatively, inherently we all know when we're not doing well. We know when we're not thinking straight, when we're not feeling a particular way, and that's of course the important area to kind of reach out for help. So often do I hear people saying, oh, something seems off with him or her, or they're going through a hard time. And even people reacting quite aggressively to that when they hear that, how are you doing? It doesn't seem like things are going well at the moment for you, can be incredibly triggering. No, everything's fine. Or why would you ask me that sort of question? As you said, to kind of find ways to just, think about what it is that you're thinking about, which sounds counterintuitive. But a perfect way to do that is just to write it down, to identify some of the thoughts that you're having. And it may even be on a superficial level, what are some of the feelings that are linked to that, So in high school, for instance, something that I experienced a lot was, how good am I in relation to my peers? What can I say that I excel at? And I think, going to a private school where they kind of, embodied this sense of, everyone is valuable and should play a role, really kind of made me feel like maybe I'm not doing enough. And, whether it's that kind of scenario or even, in a work context, are you putting in enough hours? It's really important to kind of see, well, what are the other aspects in your life that are being neglected in that moment, So perhaps not in a school context, because you are meant to dedicate your life to school and education, but when you kind of become an adult, are you spending enough time with your friends and family? How much time are you actually spending on work? How much time are you spending on your self-care? And even just mentioning that, people will say, well, no, I had a hot bath, or I took the night off, but is that really enough? Is that really something that would bring you back to that equilibrium of feeling happy, healthy, and confident in kind of going about your day-to-day activities.
Yeah. I wonder if maybe we could be a bit more specific on some of the things we've mentioned there. So I'm just wondering what we could all do today for those listening that might be experiencing anxiety right now or know somebody who is. What are some of the actions that we can take to actually address this? You've mentioned writing down your thoughts and feelings. Earlier on, you mentioned grounding techniques. Perhaps you can expand on some of these things.
So, something that I've spoken about before in another on another platform was a mindful shower, and this kind of refers back to my analogy of assessing the temperature of the water, but also of your own kind of thoughts and disposition at that moment in time. And many professionals speak about mindfulness, which is really from an Eastern philosophical, or at least originates in an Eastern philosophical kind of realm, so thinking of Buddhas and monks, and which is very much divergent from, Western psychology. But it certainly does play a role in grounding techniques itself. So to elaborate a little bit more about that, when you're kind of feeling overwhelmed, you don't necessarily think about what you are doing. It almost becomes procedural. In the same way that you get in your car and you know to move from first gear to second gear, it's not something that you are consciously aware of in that moment. And so it's really just kind of stripping back all the procedural elements of experiencing a particular moment and doing each task as if it was novel. So getting into a shower, for instance, turning on the water, getting the right temperature, maybe it's too hot, maybe it's too cold, having some of those thoughts that you're thinking about. So, I know that I need to be at work at this particular time. I know that I need to do this task, but I also know that I have 15 minutes to really enjoy the shower and to kind of experience the water on your body. Water for many people can be incredibly soothing, but it's also nourishing. So whether it's taking a bath, whether it's having a shower, or even drinking some water, or even patting some cold water on your face when you feel a little bit overwhelmed, and really just reduce that temperature on a literal sense, but can reduce the temperature on an emotional sense too, just being able to kind of calm down and be present in the moment, which is added to this mindfulness experience. So, when we talk about grounding techniques, we're talking really to what you mentioned earlier, which was the intellectual, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual kind of aspects of well-being, to kind of get yourself back to a centered space where you feel, that you're competent and able to kind of take on the tasks of the day. So a physical grounding can even be going outside and sticking your feet firmly into the grass and just experiencing what that's like. Being kind of one with nature is important for many people, but for other people, it may be going to a mosque, going to a church, going to a temple, and just become one with yourself, giving yourself that time that you need. And I think, a practical task is really to kind of set time aside for yourself. And I like to call this a worry window, where you may be incredibly anxious or worried about something, or whatever the case may be, but to set yourself some time, whether it's 10 minutes, 20 minutes, however long you feel is sufficient and necessary, and really to kind of absorb all of those emotions and be present with a task or an activity that brings you to that sense of calmness, whether it's reading, whether it's writing down. Of course, this is important for you to identify for yourself, because there is no stock standard approach to bringing you back to that centered space, and that's something that would be explored in therapy. But also to have a kind of routine around this. What happens the next time you're anxious or you're worried? What do you then do? And it sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually really important and helpful for many people is to distract themselves with these different activities, or even to engage in an excessive form of exercise. Because naturally, if your body is already quite keyed up and ready to go, of course, all your blood is already rushing to your vital organs. One way to kind of dissipate that, to engage in a parasympathetic response, is to kind of release that cortisol and adrenaline, whether it's for a run or cycling or whatever it may be. And this is, of course, quite an important element, especially given that many countries have been in lockdown and quite harsh lockdowns, situations where it's difficult to even kind of get out and breathe some fresh air.
There's so much there that I want to comment on. I was just thinking about something that a lot of us know, and it's always in the movies. It's like when something incredible is happening, often people would pinch themselves to make sure that it's actually real. And just the action of pinching yourself is a way of getting out of your head and into your body and into that present moment to really absorb whatever experience is happening. A lot of the actions and activities you mentioned, whether it be going outside, grounding yourself, putting your feet on the grass, perhaps going for a run, perhaps getting out your journal and writing down your emotions. So a lot of the activities you were mentioning were about how we can get out of our head and either into our bodies through going on a run, getting our toes in the grass outside and physically grounding ourselves to be in the present moment, or getting out of our head and into our emotions by journaling, writing down what we feel, discussing what we feel with somebody else, or perhaps getting out of our head and getting into our spiritual space. So for some people, relieving stress could come through meditation, or if you are a religious person, perhaps through prayer or practicing your faith.
Yeah.
And I think it's inspiring to look at all of these many different options because every single person is so individual. And it's not that there's a stock standard technique of how we should address stress and anxiety. It's more about let's look at the full spectrum of where your energy is currently sitting and how best we can release that in a way that might be effective to releasing some of that stress.
I think just to add to that, Kristen, these techniques are really designed, they no one needs to kind of prescribe them to you. They're something, they're things that are already accessible to us. But the importance of this, and I always stress, what is the meaning of this for a person? What would this particular activity represent for you? What does it bring you? Is really to connect with yourself. And I'd like to share an example of this. I had a client recently who is experiencing a lot of difficulties in his relationship. He found that music for him was a great way to kind of decompress, but also to express some of the emotions that he himself couldn't articulate. And I'm not sure if you are a fan of Linkin Park, the rock band, but there's a song that was titled "Somewhere Where I Belong." And this for him was really, really cathartic. And we listened to it together in the therapy session. And, there was tears, there was anger, there was all sorts of different emotions at play in the room. But to have someone witness those words being articulated, for someone to be able to hold those emotions. And, earlier you mentioned empathy, someone just being there for that person in that particular situation was so important and so helpful, and that was something incredibly powerful for me as a person who likes music and does, in this particular scenario, like Linkin Park. I was also be able to relate and understand the meaning behind some of the words that were sung in that song. But this is something that everyone needs. There is no stock standard approach towards finding your centered space, finding what works for you to bring you back to that equilibrium space. But it is really important that we kind of instill this in our daily routines, because I don't think any of the responsibilities that we have are going to go away. As I said,
A last point I wanted to discuss was earlier you said that most of us are aware of when we're not in a good space. I'm just thinking of the people that aren't aware that they're not in a good space and are kind of just bulleting forward. And often this is something that I've seen to show up in people that I know are incredibly stressed. How I've kind of processed it is perhaps when we're really stressed and seemingly there's many variables that are not in our control, we try to find things that we can control. And in doing so, we can neglect our emotions that and push them down because we're still busy, stuck in our thinking mind. And often when we are in this state of just pushing forward, it's quite difficult to receive help or feedback. And as you said, when someone asks you, hey, are you actually doing okay? It can seem quite triggering because there's a part of us that knows that we're not doing okay, but we don't want to necessarily acknowledge that. I just wonder if you've got any advice in terms of how can we approach our friends, family, and colleagues when we can see that they're stressed? Perhaps they haven't acknowledged that in themselves yet. And is this our place to do so when it is such a personal thing?
So I think, once again, this is such an incredibly difficult and kind of complex question, because only you will know what that type of person is like, what that type of friend is like, what kind of role you play with that person. But of course, there's some common kind of ways to approach this. And one of them that we've mentioned earlier is to really be empathic, to remove all element of judgment, which is often perceived by many people when you do kind of confront the person and say, well, is everything okay? I can see that something's not right. To kind of approach it in a more subtle way. You may not realize that you as a support system are so important for that person. Often people don't want to talk about what's happening in their lives, but it will emerge the more that they trust you. And, earlier you mentioned control, and control is always linked in some ways to trust when it comes to another person. So it's really important just to be present, check in on the person in a way that feels genuine and authentic. So not saying, well, is everything okay? But rather to say something like, how was your day? What did you get up to today? Or are you available for a walk in the park at 5 o'clock? Something as simple as suggesting to do an activity is, less threatening, because you're not addressing, but you are providing a different avenue for, that person to feel comfortable in maybe saying, Kristen, in the park, I'm really struggling at work, or I just, I don't know what to do with my son and his school, whatever it may be. There's always an avenue and a path. And, of course, there's professional services which are available, but many people don't necessarily seek out professional help. So, earlier we were talking about we are all psychologists, but we are also not. I think we all know people, and we all know how to make people feel better when they're feeling down. But the most important thing is just to be there and to be present and to provide that support in ways that will help them. So, in the case of perhaps a struggling mom, struggling single mom, perhaps you may offer, let me pick up your son from school, for instance. It's a genuine act of generosity, but it also expresses this kindness of, we may not be talking about you having that difficulty, but we are certainly, you're certainly providing the support to alleviate some of that stress and pressure.
Yeah, I love that, because I think something that holds a lot of us back is feeling like we have to have all the solutions and answers to whatever they might voice about what's stressing them. And we know that we won't have them, so we'd rather just not ask. Whereas what you've said, it's actually more about creating the space for them to step into. So building trust, being authentic, being present, and making them know that we really care. It sounds simple, it might be difficult, but I think when we really just lean into how we are hardwired, it's a very natural way to engage with one another, and it's a really beautiful way to support one another too. Gordon, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really interesting conversation. I know that it is a very dense conversation. I also want to acknowledge that it's not like we can discuss the full spectrum of stress and anxiety and all the possible solutions in 1 hour. But I definitely think we've uncovered some nuggets that people can look into a bit further in and of themselves.
What we've spoken about really is broad brushstrokes of a very difficult and complex kind of topic. And in saying that, I think it's important to know that when you're experiencing something like this, it can feel incredibly lonely. But there are people who do care for you, whether it's within your immediate vicinity, whether it's friends or family, or even professionals. You're not in this alone. And sometimes we all need that beacon of light when we ourselves can't find one. If you are facing a difficult kind of challenge or scenario, whether it's anxiety or something else, to know that, there are people that care for you and there are resources that you can access. So don't let it get worse. Allow yourself to get better and beat it.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. And it's a nice, it's something that offers a lot of hope, which is a great way to end our conversation today. Thank you for tuning in to today's conversation, which is part of a wider series discussing topics related to mental health. If you found value in today's episode, remember to subscribe and to share a link with friends and family. See you next time.